bleed as if you're manipulating. If you're manipulating it, it's not easy to injure this. If you know the anterethmoid artery runs within the nasal cavity. And if injury occur,
Yes.
so the question is how to prevent the injury. So I hope I answer all the points.
Dr. Kochhar sir, would you add something? Hello. Okay, Dr. Ramneet.
So again, exactly what Dr. Hitesh said, that firstly, you need to understand the anatomy by looking at the radiology. So if you have
I've just changed my location.
If you have supraorbital anterethmoidal cells, that might just push it down a little bit as well, away from the skull base. So those arteries are a little at risk of getting injured. Then again, Kiros type 3, you have injury. And as sir said, that if it's along the skull base, much less likely to be injured. But in almost a third, it can be hanging from the skull base. And in those cases, it's more likely to get injured. So to prevent injury, you need to be sure of that. Plus your technique, the surgical technique that you follow. So either you're very careful about, the exact location, an experienced surgeon, then you're more, you can identify the anterior ethmoidal carefully, but otherwise for junior colleagues, at least, maybe they can start off with doing the intact bulla technique, open your frontal recess, and that will keep the anterior ethmoidal away in majority, and then keeping it away, you open the frontal recess and then you do your anterior ethmoidectomy. If you need widening of the frontal, you can come back to it, but identify the frontal first. And so there's one cell behind the frontal recess, which the posterior border of which is generally a landmark, surgical landmark for your anterior ethmoidal. So you open the frontal, then go ahead with the anterior ethmoidectomy or the posterior, and then you come back to the frontal. So yes, identification of the frontal recess is also a good step to identify it.
Hitesh sir, how will you manage if there is anterethmoidal hemorrhage is there? How will you manage that? How to manage that?
For best way is by preoperative identification. And if you are careful handling is important. In that area, it's run behind the posterior end of the frontal ostium, just behind the posterior end. So if you're dealing that area carefully, you just remove the soft tissue part. Deliberate plucking should be avoided because it can injure. So once you remove the mucosa, then you can clearly see where the anterethmoid artery is here, so that you can prevent the injury.
So what are the preoperative landmarks you see in a CT scan to identify the anterethmoidal artery?
Preoperative landmarks is a Kennedy's nipple, which is a most important landmark, and type of Kiros types and presence of supraorbital recess and wider anteroposterior frontal sinus diameter than frontal artery. These are in favor of intranasal course of the anterethmoid artery. So this is one of the landmark. And intraoperative, first you identify either you go from posterior to anterior, or so that you can identify the skull base. And it's better than you can reach up to the frontal sinus, because if you're dealing in, if the disease is extensive and if it is involving up to the skull base, better to go from posterior to anterior. If you have limited disease, and you can go with intact bulla technique and directly into the frontal sinus. By that you can prevent, as Ravneet told her.
Kochhar sir is there.
I am so sorry. I had a power outage at my area, so my network got lost.
Okay.
Change my location. Yeah.
So the question was for the anterethmoidal bleeding. Preoperatively, what are the landmarks you will identify, and how will you manage a case of anterethmoidal hemorrhage?
First of all, I was there when Dr. Hitesh had mentioned the point regarding preoperative radiology and its importance in anticipating the problem. So if there is a gross disease in the anterior part, it is prudent to identify the nimble where the anterior ethmoidal artery enters into the upper part of ethmoidal labyrinth. if we see anatomically, it would be just about half a centimeter posterior to the frontonasal recess area, and then we have to track the basal lamella upwards up till the junction, and then have the location of the anterior ethmoidal artery. In case there is inadvertent injury, actually the dimension of the artery is not much, but the whole issue is when the artery gets retracted into the orbital cavity, that is the main problem. Even if there is injury on table, the best way to is just do suction with one hand if the assistant is cooperative enough, and then cauterize it with bipolar forceps. It's not a big deal. So there is no need to be scared of the artery. And then if the artery retracts, then there is probably a separate discussion on that topic. If it retracts into the orbital cavity, how to manage that.
Sir, is it always?
Good afternoon, sir.
Hi,
Sir,
good afternoon.
Ravneet sir, can we say that it is always advisable to go ahead with intact bulla technique?
Again, it's about how you, how you've always practiced and what you've learned. So my learning has been mostly with the intact bulla technique. So that's what I prefer to do to keep the anterior ethmoidal away. So I do the intact bulla, I identify the frontal. I only identify, I don't widen it a lot. I identify the frontal, then I know exactly that one cell behind will be the anterior ethmoidal. And then I go ahead with the anterior ethmoidectomy. So, as sir said that you can come from posterior to anterior as well. And again, it's more on how you've trained, and if you're, and again, as I said, that don't, like, if somebody is doing in another way and that's a safe way. I prefer to do it in intact bulla because that's what I've always done, and it has worked for me till now. But yes, it keeps it safe, and anatomically, in more than 85% of the cases, it will be behind it, and you're more likely to be safe. But that's not 100% technique. I mean, you can't say the 100% of the time you're going to be safe there, because you can have some
Variations.
frontal anterior ethmoidal cells which can push it a little anteriorly. There are reports of it being anterior to it. Yeah, but more often than not, you're pretty safe. Again, then don't go blindly, right? You can't say that because I'm doing frontal, the intact bulla, that I'll just blindly go and start resecting anything. You again have to be careful, do it under complete visualization, widen your area, use angled scopes if necessary. If you're like with frontal, I always take an angled scope and do it. So I have a wider area which is visualized, although I do it, but I again, whatever technique you follow, just make sure you're well versed with the technique and well versed with the anatomy, so you can localize it and identify the bleed wherever necessary, and then you can bipolarize it.
Okay, thank you.
So the next scenario is how to prevent injury to the internal carotid artery and manage. Hitesh sir.
So again, anatomy is important. If there's a different type of pneumatization of sphenoid sinus. So if sphenoid sinus is cellar or post-cellar kind of pneumatization, then bony party wall may be thin or may be absent, and dehiscence most commonly seen in cellar type of or post-cellar type of pneumatization. So you have to be careful in such cases, and some accessory sphenoid septas can be attached with the internal carotid artery. So unnecessary avulsing of these septas should be avoided. If required, drilling is better rather than avulsing the accessory sphenoid septas. And once injuries occurred, so it's depend, either you are doing endoscopic surgery or open surgery. If you're doing endoscopic surgery, you better to pack the cavity, and then you can do intervention radiology and localize a site of defect, and then you can go ahead with either stenting or coiling of that area. Or if you are doing open surgery, then maybe you can ligate, but most important thing is a contralateral cross circulation. So before ligating the internal carotid artery, you should know what is a cross circulation, because the risk of stroke is very high once you ligate that. So it's better to go for intervention, packing and intervention, and then planning according to that. Sometimes literature says a small amount of muscle plug can be applied over the bleeding side, but it's generally bleeding profusely, so it's tough, and experienced surgeon can do that.
Dr. Ramneet, your point.
Or you can do in if you don't have setup, then you can identify it in the neck, because internal carotid artery doesn't have any blood supply in the neck, so that you can take a control in the neck.
I mean, again, it's a very rare complication, less than 1% incidence in literature. But again, this is something that everybody should know how to, like a basic management should be known. And exactly as sir said, you pack the sinus as soon as you identify the bleed. And if it's an internal carotid bleed, you will know, because that will profusely bleed. You won't be able to visualize anything. So the first step would always be just pack the nose and stop the bleed. Now, there are some I mean, there are some variations, variation on thought on if you pack it too. I mean, if you pack it too much, it can actually cause the compression of the artery as well. Again, that depends on how much the artery is exposed and what size of the rent is there. So if you do that, the second step would be go for angiography. Now, again, as I said, if you pack it too tightly, the artery can be compressed, and on angiography, you might not identify an obvious bleed, but that does not rule out a bleed. So you might have to loosen the pack a bit, repeat the angiography, and identify the lesion. Again, you do it after after 1 or 2 days, then you might find a pseudoaneurysm as well on angiography. So all these things have to be visualized and identified and treated accordingly. With regards to your angiography, you might, again, as I said, that stenting and coiling can be done. Again, with the stent, the advantage is that you'll have a flow with the stent. But we do have to realize that the stents can also thrombose. There's about a 5% risk of a stent also thrombosing. So cross circulation for that balloon occlusion test may be performed. And if you don't have a stent, and the stent is sometimes very hard to place. So the only option that might be left with is if you have a cerebral angiography setup and you have an interventional radiologist, then you can just go ahead and put a balloon or do an embolization with coil. Again, that provides a risk of stroke, and although the incidence of stroke is there after even after balloon occlusion test, you might get it. There's 10% chance that the patient might still develop a stroke. And we've had one case where we placed a stent. The patient did have some motor defects after even the stent, but after intensive rehabilitation, a lot of these patients will recover. So again, as I said, it's a rare complication, but you need to be aware of it and identify it, and you should know how to manage it. There's a good chance you might never have to see it, and God forbid if you ever have to, but if it happens, then it's very important that you understand the management steps and what to do next. So again, having an interventional radiologist is a boon in such times. We don't have an interventional radiologist, but what we did was we have a cath lab here, and so we went to the cardiologist, and he was helpful enough to help us place the stent as well. I mean, yeah, so whatever you have, work with that. And yeah, and last option would be go to the neck and get a control there.
Richard, sir, your points.
Yeah, first of all, as Dr. Hitesh said, preoperative radiology is paramount. So identifying sometimes even the nodal cell, any horizontal partition within the sphenoid sinus would be a nodal cell. So if you're aware of a nodal cell, then we are aware that probably lateral to this, there are important neurovascular structures which can be harmed. And as Dr. Verma said, that there are chances of dehiscence of this bone, and in most of the cases, the thickness of the bone is about 0.5 millimeters. So it is not going to be a surgical safeguard. It should not be breached at all. The lateral, the angle of the forceps should never be placed laterally. And after we've still encountered this process, immediately we have to compress the internal carotid artery in the neck while placement of the pack in the nasal cavity. So there will be profuse bleed. We won't be able to visualize a lot of structures there, but it has to be probably a semi-blind kind of a packing. After a thorough packing is done, we still should be aware that any kind of excessive pressure may cause blockage and infarction. But at the same time, the further management would depend upon the avenues available with us. If we don't have a good radiology backup, temporalis muscle fascia crush tissue can be placed inside. On top of that, a hydrated dressing can be placed, and then this packing should be removed in the operating room after 2 days. Apart from that, if we have an option of endovascular intervention, then probably that can be resorted to. But as this procedure has gained popularity, in almost the majority of the cases, the surgery has been performed in centers where we don't have interventional radiology backup. So we should ideally be aware of this. Paramount is to counsel the patient appropriately prior to surgery. So there are chances of this happening in cases where the anatomy is distorted, where there is potential revision surgery, landmarks are gone. So we should, in general FES, we may not counsel the patient for internal carotid artery rupture. Now, that kind of a counseling would mean that the patient will be not alert enough to give consent for even a simple procedure. But if the cases, it is expected that if the cases have revision and then the chances of injury are more, we should appropriately counsel them prior to surgery.
Hitesh sir,
last question. Hitesh, what is the percentage of injury to internal carotid artery?
So it's very rare, maybe less, it's 1 is 1,000 times. We can say. I have, sir, around maybe, it's very rare, less than a percent.
Rare,
yes, sir.
What's the commonest complications you get in FES complication?
Sir, receptor adhesion, synechia formation. In FES.
Complication of FES. Synechia can be a complication of any nasal surgery.
Yes, sir.
Specifically,
but it is most common for nasal surgery and FES. It's around 40%, and literature says it's around 40%, and we have seen synechia.
Synechia,
so
you can have
can be happen.
Septoplasty also.
Other one is a orbital. Next is a orbital injury.
No.
After that,
is CSF leak 0.02%.
So CSF leak is very that is happened, but it's also very rare in FES.
But that's the commonest complication of FES. You're not talking about nasal surgery. We're talking about complication of FES.
Yes, sir. But it's mentioned in literature. But if you review the literature, it's relatively less. Most common is synechia, then orbital injury, then comes the intracranial complications. Recently, I reviewed, sir, this. I written a book on that, Essentials of Rhinology. So it's mentioned there. CSF is very rare, sir.
Of course, it's rare, but synechia can be there because of, not necessarily because of FES. It can be because of any nasal surgery.
Yes, sir. That can be a point.
Yes, sir. But pertaining just to FES, if you ask me also, like in FES, what is the most common complication? I'd probably have to go with synechia. Just pertaining to FES, not worrying about what other surgeries can cause synechia.
Sorry for interruption, Rohit. Rohit, sorry for interruption, Raj. I just wanted to ask one thing: how to avoid synechia? What is the best way to avoid synechia? As we were discussing the synechia and septoplasty, synechia and FES, what is the rule? How to avoid it?
So that is the next question is there. In the next slide, it is there, sir. Synechia, we have.
Because I'm in last, I don't know my young boys know me or not, but I have 35 years working in Maulana Azad. That's why I'm asking. I have seen a number of cases. I don't want to name my senior colleague. Hitesh must be knowing. He has a habit of making synechias. I have seen in most of the cases. He's a very senior colleague. In most of the cases, he used to do the synechia. That's why I'm asking. What is the best way to avoid the synechia? I think, Rohit, you must be knowing, because that was Lucknow teaching how to avoid synechia.
Yes, we use.
Can I answer? Sir, can I answer?
Yes.
Sir, best ways to avoid the synechia is anatomical knowledge, avoiding injury to the surrounding structure which are not required, and removal of all loose hanging tissue that created during the surgery, remove all bony chips that can create granulation and synechiae formation, and proper placement of packing during surgery. So
Yes.
packing should be done by the surgeon. Majority
Yes.
of time surgeon operated and they left with juniors for
That is-
packing, and
is a gold-
regular removal of crusting in post-op period.
Is the more golden rule, and follow-up has to be done by the senior proper surgeon.
Yes.
Youngsters, the regular cleaning of the nose and look after by the senior surgeon. Okay, to follow up.
Yes, sir.
I think
Yes.
Ravi is also entered again. Ravi, have you entered?
Ravi
Dr.
sir, are
Ravi?
you there?
He has entered. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Another
Sorry for interruption.
with regards to Synechiae, another thing that I would like to add is patient education regarding taking care of the post-operative, the post-op period. I would say Synechiae 50% of the times would be the surgeon's responsibility. 100% of the time, if you don't teach the patient how to do a proper nasal dressing afterwards. So that also you have to personally teach the patient, sit with the patient. That's what our protocol is. We sit with him, and for the first few times, we teach him exactly how to do it. And again, at every visit, you have to keep telling the patient and just keep telling the patient that this is something that's really important for you to do in the post-operative period. Keep telling him that your result will depend upon your nasal douching. And the type of nasal douching, what materials you use, some people use budesonide, some people use hypertonic saline, that would vary.
Yeah. I do agree. The equal responsibility lies with the patient. And teaching is very important, as you rightly said, because doctors have 50% responsibility. Same to teaching is very, very much important. And follow up and nasal douching.
If you're talking about Synechiae, I feel that sometimes the Synechiae tell about who is at fault. If there are thick, big bands of Synechiae, it would be sometimes the surgeon's responsibility, because we've created raw edges on both the sides. And if it is thin Synechiae, then it is probably responsibility in the post-operative period where the care has not been taken enough, either by the surgeon in cleaning the nasal cavity or by the patient in not adhering to the proper irrigation protocols.
And mobilization of middle turbinate is also responsible. If your middle turbinate has 3 attachments, if you're removing more than ground, we are basically ground lamella is indicated for removal, but you have to preserve the horizontal and vertical attachments. If they are loosened, then there are chances middle turbinate either may be displaced medially or laterally. In that case, either suture medialization or bolgerization is a technique, so to prevent the Synechiae formation.
Again, with that, so when we displace the middle turbinate during the procedure, we tend to produce microfractures between the first and the second part of the middle turbinate to lateralize it, to medialize it. So again, don't keep medializing, lateralizing it. And again, another thing is that there has been a study done over time-lapse videos are available that over the next 3 months, the middle turbinate does tend to again lateralize. So it can go and form Synechiae and close up the middle meatus again. So as sir said, vulgarization or suturing of the middle turbinate, although not very frequently done, and I'll be very frank, we don't follow it. But yes, that might be helpful if you do it. That's a welcome step if you plan on doing it. Another thing with regards to the surgeon's responsibility, mucosal preservation is really important. Like, don't keep stripping off mucosa wherever you see. Blindly don't start cutting off things and creating raw edges. That is another important thing. And the rest, I totally agree with Dr. Hitesh that your edges should need to be absolutely clean, and wherever you have raw edges, and that will lead to Synechiae formation. So the surgical technique per se has to be precise, and you have to be very particular about, because once you do the procedure, you remove a lot of polyps. Some surgeons I've seen, especially the junior colleagues, they will remove a lot of it and then they'll just leave it like that. Just remove most of the polyps or anything, and then they'll leave raw edges, and that is a recipe for disaster in the post-operative period.
Now, one particular surgery where we have done septoplasty we've done endoscopic sinus surgery and turbinate reduction. Now, this is a kind of a situation where there is a high chance of Seneca formation because opposite edges have been created. Here, septoplasty is the one which is done by endoscopic route, and the incision has been placed right over the spur. Obviously, anterior hemitransfixation incision will not lead to this kind of issue. In these cases, on occasion, placing a internal nasal splint, fluoroplastic splint for about a week has really helped mitigate the issue of Seneca formation.
Exactly, sir. After pack removal, earlier they used to put X-ray plates also, and I think the splint is a much better idea. It's doesn't have any sharp edges, helps the patient breathe, and there was some crusting happens, I think, more with the X-ray plate. So we've also switched to the splints more than the X-ray plate for anything when you have opposing raw edges.
One more addition: if we are using absorbable nasal packing, so we should remove by 2 weeks because they can create granulation and Seneca formation. So that should be cleaned by 2 weeks.
Sir, regarding Synechia formation, what is the importance of mitomycin C immediate post-operatively in prevention of adhesions or Synechia formation?
Dr. Hitesh, I think being institutional protocols, let's start with you.
We are not using it for Seneca prevention. It's best way to proper placement of packing and avoiding unnecessary trauma to the mucosa. That is the best way. Mitomycin C may be for academic purpose, but we are not using it. We are using mitomycin C only in the cases of larynx, where the displacement is not possible by packing. There you can use it, but not in nose.
Sir, regarding endoscopic DCR for stoma, the studies are there for mitomycin C.
Yeah,
Literature is there, but
okay. I was about to come to that. That was
sir, you
probably
carry
my
on.
only, that was probably my only indication where I could consider where there is very less space between the septum and the stoma which has been created, despite carrying out septoplasty, and it's a revision surgery. So the indication would be very, very limited. In these cases where we've done a revision surgery, but we find that the space is still narrow and still further Seneca formation can occur. So either we insinuate a celastic splint, a celastic sheet there, and apply mitomycin. That is probably the only best way to prevent recurrence.
Basically, surgeons are using, but literature is not in favor of neither stenting and applying the mitomycin C, because correct way of, if you are preserving the mucosa, then anyhow the risk of Seneca is less, like flap techniques in DCR that can prevent adhesion formation of Seneca.
So again, with the
But yes, literature on mitomycin C is available in DCR.
So particularly with FES, I don't think there is the literature supports use of mitomycin. But again, as Dr. Kocher said, if you have a revision case, if you think that it's getting too close for comfort, then I don't think there's any harm in using it. But again, as I said, the literature doesn't really support it. Obviously, there is I haven't found any literature saying just for revision surgery, but particularly just for purely for FES as a primary surgery, no real indication. And again, even in DCR, if you don't leave any raw bone, the risk of adhesions and Seneca is very low. So not everybody uses mitomycin C. Rather, people prefer to use flaps to cover the exposed bone. So yes, there are some potential uses, but again, not proven. And again, it's up to the surgeon to take a call that whether they want to use it. And again, personal experiences do vary.
Next is Hitesh sir, how to prevent and manage injury to the nasolacrimal duct, NLD.
So there's a nasolacrimal duct runs a variable course in the medial wall of the maxillary sinus. So if maxillary sinus is hyperpneumatized, then there's a chances that nasolacrimal duct runs within the medial wall. So that the risk of injury is high. So in best way to avoid the injury is assessing the pre-operative radiology and the course of the nasolacrimal duct. So if disease is limited, so for maxillary entrostment, it's better to widen it in the posterior part rather than in more anteriorly. So the literature also divides the enterostomy into 3 different types, where in type 3 you remove the anterior wall. So if if just a secretion, then just widening of maxillary sinus is sufficient enough. But if there is a nasal polyposis and mucosa is polypoidal in the maxillary sinus, so then you can do posterior widening. But if there is a AFR impacted fungus, then you need wider opening of the. In that case, you may require preoperative assessment. And if you're planning, it's better to go from anterior to posterior direction uncinectomy rather than backward direction if it is running in the medial wall. Like we are using backbiting for all the cases. So if it is running in the medial wall, it's better to go in anterior to posterior direction if feasible. Then risk of injury is less to the nasolacrimal duct as compared to the backbiting technique. So there's a very good literature is available from India, published in Rhinology, where the course is assessed on nasolacrimal duct and space is available for access, basically to access the infratemporal fossa. Then that literature is generated on the course of the nasolacrimal duct.
Dr. Kochar,
So otherwise we have good instruments now, so we can angle instruments and like that, but we can avoid the injury of nasolacrimal duct with these instruments.
Sir, how will you manage that if injury occurs then?
Yeah, first of all,
it's better if.
Okay,
sir. Yeah.
No, please, Dr.
Yes,
please continue.
No, sir, you continue,
sir. We are aware of while we are doing endoscopic DCR, we are aware of the location of the lacrimal sac, and then we can track it downward and have a rough idea of where the opening in the inferior meatus it is there. So we have a rough idea where maxillary line is, and anterior to that, if you are using instruments without due diligence, there is a chance that we may injure the nasolacrimal duct. Now, nasolacrimal duct is also encompassed; it's encased in a thick bone. So there is a chance that the duct injury may not actually happen. Once the duct injury occurs, it's better to cut it in a stepwise oblique fashion so that there is no stenosis of the duct. And even if those margins are not clear and there is a lot of soft tissue in that area, you can simply go up and incise the lacrimal sac, create a mucosal fold of the medial wall, and create a endoscopic DCR kind of a approach right during the surgery itself.
I would just like to add that, I mean, an occult injury of the nasolacrimal duct is actually much more common than we actually see. But most of these will actually heal on their own. Like a superficial injury to the nasolacrimal duct, as I said, there's a thick bone over it. So you don't always have to do it unless and until you identify that you've clearly cut the nasolacrimal duct. Then you go ahead, put an angulated cut, widen the opening and just let it drain. But otherwise, if you're doubtful that there is some superficial injury to the nasolacrimal duct, most of these will actually recover over a 2-week period. So again, firstly, coming to the surgical technique, as I said, you stay in the maxillary line and you take out the uncinate with the help of a sickle knife or a Frias elevator. Even if you're coming posterior to anterior by a backbiter, again, another important point is that you need to direct the backbiter inferiorly, a little inferiorly, especially on your second cut, so that you stay away from the nasolacrimal duct as it just passes a little anteriorly. And again, radiology is important. So the nasolacrimal duct anterior to the maxillary line can be anywhere between 1 to 8 millimeters away from it. So if on radiology you have a little idea that yes, my nasolacrimal duct is a little closer, then you might want to just restrict yourself to a smaller bite on the backbiting forceps. And again, you visualize your maxillary antrum with an angled endoscope. If you have a close relationship, you visualize and you don't do an excessive widening of the maxillary enterostomy. You go more posteriorly. You try and preserve the nasolacrimal duct. Again, as ENT surgeons, you should know how to evaluate any nasolacrimal duct obstruction or a blockage. And post-operatively, you can just follow up with some syringing of the nasolacrimal duct. If you think there's some epiphora, I would still suggest go up and follow up for another 2 to 3 weeks before doing actively during the primary surgery, doing anything actively, unless and until, of course, you've completely damaged it.
Massaging
One
is very
scenario in
important in
which,
that period.
please continue, Dr. Hitesh.
Once injuries occur and epipora is there, then massaging is very important before the final healing take place and stenosis occur. So like in children's, we are doing massaging, we can do massaging in such kind of patient. So that can reduce the chances of, that can reduce the risk, indication for surgery. That can create patency.
One scenario in which we would purposely damage this particular part is endoscopic Denker's approach for inverted papilloma or the tumors of maxillary sinus. So in those cases, we are actively looking for the nasolacrimal duct, injuring, cross-cutting it, and all kind of maneuvers to prevent those kind of things happening. So during these surgeries, if we are aware of the course of the duct, and then we can apply that particular knowledge into a routine phase surgery, it is important for the surgeon, and he would get an idea where actually the course of this is in other cases as well.
Yes, sir. Hitesh, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir, for uncinectomy, you will prefer backbiter or sickle or a macrodivider, sir? What should be your point?
So if the relationship of the uncinate process with the maxillary line is very important. If it is uncinate process is much more lateral to that line, then the chances your instrument will be at angle. Then the risk of injury to the orbit is high. In such cases, it's better to go for backbiting. Or if uncinate process is medial, then you can do with this anterior to posterior technique. But now it's better way where you just fractured it with either the ball probe and some instrument. You can fracture it medially, then you can remove by any of the instrument. Or if there is a accessory ostium is there, then you can utilize the accessory ostium to identify the maxillary sinus, and then you can widen your ostium.
Dr. Ravneet?
Yes.
Uncinectomy, you will use backbiter or a sickle or a macrodivider?
Again, as I said, like one technique that you are most comfortable with, always be, don't be shy from using it. I generally use a backbiter, but before using the backbiter, I always use a ball probe and just, medialize the uncinate a little bit. And then I use the backbiter. Again, the direction of the backbiter is really important. And you keep it, when you're directing it, you direct it a little inferiorly. And till now, I haven't had any injuries with and I actually started off using the sickle or the Freers elevator to go to the maxillary line and breaking it. But that's the, technique that I have switched to with the backbiter. Again, as I said, if you look at the anatomy very carefully on the CT scan, and if you think you can injure the nasolacrimal duct that is really close to the maxillary line, then I might shift my technique. But till now, I haven't had to.
Dr. Kochhar?
Yeah, if the groove at the uncinate attachment is pretty clear, I'm very tempted to use a sickle knife to remove it. But if the groove is not proper, then I'm a bit, see, the more common complications, the more common causes of recurrence are patent, partly uncinate process, partly remnant of the uncinate. So to prevent that, I would, in those cases where the groove is not very clear, I would rather use a ballpoint probe, medialize, and then take a pediatric backbiting and remove it multiple bites.
And one is very good technique, swing door technique. In this, you bite uncinate process at two different levels. One is inferior, one is superior. So that you can open up it like a book and then you can remove the uncinate process.
Yes, sir. So next is how to prevent post-op frontal recess stenosis. What steps you will take? Hitesh, sir.
So it's depend upon the disease. If there are three different type of disease, one is just obstructing the ostia. For example, if there is an antiarrhythmoid sinusitis, it's just obstructing the ostia. So in that case, ethmoid, you can remove the disease from ethmoid and avoiding manipulation of the frontal sinus. This is the best way to avoid stenosis. If you are involved, if the frontal sinus is involved, so it's better to preserve the wall at one end rather than removing the wall from all surroundings. You at least preserve the wall at one end so that the risk of restenosis is less. And regular and if widening is done in surgery, then regular follow-up with endoscopic follow-up is important. And you should remove the crusting and all retained secretion and polypoidal tissue from that area. And you can apply some kind of drugs like in post-op period so that the risk of stenosis is less.
Kochhar sir, your points.
The thing is that I am not much into advanced frontal sinus surgeries. I usually end up in type 1 only, and since I don't have a drill, endonasal drill, so I don't resort to type 2B procedures. I usually keep the dissection in this area. If I can, I keep it pretty neat, and I don't want to injure the mucosa on at least two sides, at least one side, so that there is a risk for stenosis. The opening should be, I'm not aiming for a very big opening. The opening should be decent enough, oval, at least 5 by 7 millimeters would suffice. If I'm able to achieve that, I don't dissect much. And as I said, I don't do advanced procedure in the frontal sinus, so probably I'm not much qualified to answer this.
Dr. Ravneet.
So again, as I said, if the frontal sinus is not involved, I mean, stay away. Especially if you're not very well versed with doing work around the frontal, just leave it alone. And that's what I also followed for a long time till I had some kind of experience, especially using the angled endoscopes. So my first suggestion would be when you're doing the frontal, learn how to do work with the 70-degree endoscope, or at least a 30-degree. A 70 would be preferable, because then you get a wider visualization. Again, don't injure the mucosa unnecessarily. If preoperatively with the CT scan, you'll get an indication regarding if there is any disease in the frontal sinus or not. If not, just remove the agonizai or any of the uncapping of the egg. Do that, your frontal will be much wider. As Dr. Kochhar said, there is an international consensus meeting was done, and they decided that 6 millimeter was the minimum that you needed for the frontal to not restenose. But again, you cannot manage to measure 6 millimeter or 7 millimeter or 5 millimeter intraoperatively. So again, if you're keeping the mucosa as it is all around, don't injure more than one side, you're much less likely to end up in trouble. But again, one of the biggest problems is that if you end up doing frontal work and you haven't made the opening wider, you've injured mucosa all around, then you're actually going to give the patient an iatrogenic sinusitis in the post-operative period, and that's actually worse. So which will then the patient might have to go for a draft 2 or a draft 3 later. So according to your own skill, manage the frontal according to that only. And unnecessary instrumentation, again, a lot of people go blindly into the frontal. When you're trying to push a suction or anything blindly into the frontal, not only will you injure the skull base, risk of injuring the skull base is there, but you also cause a lot of raw tissue, because you're just pushing mucosa all around, and you're causing trauma to the tissues. So don't do that. Just make sure you identify the cells. As soon as you take the agonizai or in CT scan, if you've identified a frontoethmoidal cell, you remove that cell. And in more often than not, you'll find that the frontal recess is itself pretty wide, and I would rather not do any work more than that in that region.
One more addition. If mucosa is injured all around, so you can use some mucosal graft or flaps to cover the area so that the risk of restenosis will be less. Like in draft 2 or draft 3, it's some graft flap so that you can avoid the stenosis.
Yes, sir. What is your point on balloon sinuplasty in frontal sinus?
I feel balloon sinuplasty is over used without much indication. For example, if there is a clear cut It's like for frontal sinus, if there's a clear-cut frontal sinus stenosis, which can happen in trauma cases, then or ethmoid is totally clear. In such cases, you can do, or like in maxillary sinusitis or even in sphenoid, when the ostia is a problem. If the underlying pathology is there, then it's better to deal with the underlying pathology. Balloon sinuplasty has not much role in this. So it's very limited indication, but here people are using in unnecessary cases also.
So again, with the balloon sinuplasty, I don't have any personal experience of using it except on some models and all. But a lot of people who have used a lot of balloon sinuplasty do not actually stop using it. Like people who operated hundreds of cases then stop using it because again, it just causes microfractures. They've recently again reported that the stenosis comes back. Very limited indication, as I said. Maybe patients who cannot tolerate like any major surgery, have an isolated frontal disease. Maybe pediatric patients, again, in all these cases, there are very few indications. But again, I have no personal experience of using it, and unless and until you have a very specific indication for it, I don't think it should be utilized in our regular practice.
So I used balloon sinuplasty when it was initially launched in vogue. I did about 10-15 cases, but then I stopped doing for the last 8 years. Probably the only indication in frontal sinus where I could consider that is a non-resolving acute sinusitis. Other than that, I don't think it's a very helpful technique, because most of the cases we are operating are either of nasal polypi where at least we have to exenterate all the cells, or there would be multiple soft tissue density within multiple ethmoidal cells as well. So in those cases, balloon sinuplasty. Now, the selling point of this is do a hybrid surgery. What is the point of doing a hybrid surgery? We are going to exenterate all the agonist anterior ethmoid, posterior ethmoid, and then putting a balloon up and then opening it up. So really see no point. The only probably indication is acute sinusitis, which is not resolving with medical treatment, which is again pretty unusual. Now, the cost is pretty prohibitive. It's not easy to counsel the patient to take up this procedure. The cost of you add a cost of balloon, and then you add the cost of the surgery. It becomes pretty prohibitive.
Hitesh sir, for the juniors, can you elaborate the anatomical landmarks for them to approach the frontal sinus, sir?
For anatomical landmarks is for frontal sinus, it's best way to gain access because we are getting extensive diseases. So it's best way to get access from posterior to anterior. If you have limited disease and intact bulla, you identify the bulla. If there's no disease in bulla, then you can do with intact bulla technique. Otherwise, if bulla is deformed, and in that case, there's a problem. In that case, you can't do intact bulla technique. Other one is axillary flap technique. If you have doubt, then you can go ahead with axillary flap and you can access the frontal sinus by removing the frontal peak. So these are the basically which I follow.
Dr. Ravneet?
Or if you're not able to identify the frontal sinus, in that case, frontal trephination can be done. So you can place light, there is a DCR probe is there, by which you can place a light and you can identify the frontal sinus, or by doing the trephination, you can introduce some colored fluid so that you can identify where is the ostia and you can proceed with the surgery in difficult cases.
Dr. Ravneet?
So again, coming back to the same point again and again, radiology first. I mean, identify whether there's an agonasa, if there is a type of frontal ethmoidal cell, or you have to know how many cells you have to remove before you reach the frontal recess per se. Again, then identify your lamina laterally, identify your middle turbinate anteriorly if you know where exactly the beak is. And again, as I do it, I use the intact bulla, so I keep the bulla intact. Bulla is my posterior limit, and between that, use an angled endoscope. I do not do frontal without an angled endoscope. And identifying all these landmarks, then you remove the cells that you've identified, and more often than not, you'll end up opening the frontal recess. And again, no blind introduction of any suction or forceps or anything, or a pack, like pushing a pack, trying to identify it. Don't do that. Just visualize it, widen your area and visualize it, and then open it.
So, role of lateral canthotomy and inferior cantholysis in management of orbital hematoma. So, how will you manage orbital hematoma post-operatively or intraoperative? It is, sir.
So it's very rare complication. If you know the anatomy, then it's very rare. Yes, if it is diagnosed intraoperatively, so how to diagnose orbital hematoma intraoperatively? You may have some changes in your anesthetist colleague will tell you that there is a bradycardia or hypotension can happen. If you saw orbitis progressively increase and there is a proptosis, dilated fixed pupil, and there is a congested, there is a chemosis, then it is indicative of orbital hematoma. So if it is diagnosed intraoperatively, it's better to go for orbital and optic nerve decompression. And if it is diagnosed in ward, then if the pressure is increasing, then you can, there is a two different type of orbital hematoma. One is venous type and one is arterial type. If venous type, it's very slow progressive, then you can avoid the cantholysis and canthotomy. If it is arterial type, like post-fess enterethmoid artery retracted into the orbit, then you can go ahead with canthotomy or cantholysis. It can reduce up to 20 mm of HG pressure. So you can avoid subsequent surgery. And if still pressure is going on, then you can go ahead with orbital and optic nerve decompression. And steroid.
Again, knowledge is more important, because many times we won't end up doing this procedure in our practice. But whenever this inadvertent problem occurs, we should know how to handle that. So a couple of things to keep in mind, that it's mainly the cantholysis which releases the pressure and not the canthotomy. So we have to not only incise the skin part, but we have to go ahead and do the release of the inferior part of this lateral lacrimal ligament. And exophthalmos per se is not a very sensitive indicator of raised intraocular pressure. It's basically afferent pupillary defect, and if possible, measurement of the intraocular pressure. More than 40 millimeters would usually guide you for doing a lateral cantholysis. And secondly, the time is paramount. Between 90 to 120 minutes is usual protocols that we have to address this very early. So asking your ward staff or the ward resident about the possible outcome in this particular case, and then how early to address this. If they are waiting for more than a couple of hours for this problem to develop, then to address this problem, then probably it's already too late. And then the surgical part per se, the procedure itself can be done under local anesthesia and infiltration, and then release of the skin, and then releasing the ligament right up till the lateral canthal tubercle. First inferior, then if needed, then the superior one also. How to angle the forceps towards the lateral aspect and preventing injury medially to the lateral rectus, to the superior palpebral muscles, lacrimal gland. So everything is mostly, for most of us, is just a theoretical part, because as Dr. Hitesh and I feel that we probably will not be able to do this in our lifetime. And since Dr. Hitesh would know that since we become seniors, so it's mostly in the hand of junior resident or senior resident to accomplish this task. Till the time we end up responding to this particular problem, it's already been addressed.
Dr. Avneet?
As I said, intraoperatively, if you identified there's a anterior ethmoidal artery injury which has retracted, then you can just go ahead to the medial decompression. If needed, then maybe do the cantholysis laterally as well, and decompress a little laterally. Again, as I said, it's kind of an emergency. Within the first 1.5 hours, you have to address it. So again, post-operative care, once the patient is extubated, what we do is we keep our patients in the post-operative room for at least an hour we keep asking our residents to keep checking on the at least every 20 minutes or so. Just the first checkup is more of the patient, there is no drip or anything, and then again we always check for the eyes, how the pupils are reacting, and whether the patient has any ecchymosis or anything. Again, these are part of the protocol. A lot of these times as junior people don't, the residents don't understand why we're doing this, because there's never anything abnormal, but it's for that one patient that might have such a problem that you need to keep doing this. And make sure your immediate post-operative eye checkup is done no matter what, at least for an hour and a half. Just monitor it. We've had, I've only assisted one case where anterethmoidal artery was injured and retracted, and intraoperatively we did a medial decompression as well as we had to do a lateral decompression. Again, first you remove the inferior part, and only if necessary you have to cut the whole ligament in the lateral cantholysis has to be completed then. But again, rare thing, you should know how to catch it, and then you can manage it.
One more point, when some people are using anterethmoid nerve block during FES. So if they are introducing needle very much inside, then they can injure anterethmoid artery while blocking them. So in that case, you can identify the dilated fixed pupil and like that. So careful while injecting. This is less commonly mentioned in the book, but this is one of the cause for anterethmoid artery bleeding.
Sir, how to deal with complications like entrapped medial rectus muscle during intraoperatively? If the patient comes with unable to move the eye medially, even left or right. We had one case, actually I was in
medial rectus entrapment is very rare, because it's not entrapped in the if you're removing the laminum papyracea, then entrapment is rare. Entrapment can happen when there is a blowout injury, but in FES it's very less likely that entrapment is there. If it is entrapment you identify, then it's better to release entrapment, but do force duction test first, that you can confirm there's an entrapment or just a inflammatory restriction of eye movement. So force duction test suggests if there is an entrapment, then it's better to release entrapment, because fibrosis can create, and later on the muscle get fibrosed and the patient will have squint subsequently.
Last one is CSF leak, sir. How to what investigation you are going to do, and how do you are going to manage? What material you will use for closure? Kocher, sir.
CSF leak would occur if we are not very well conversant with the skull base anatomy. My preference is to always address this while coming from posterior to anterior. I would look at the cells in the skull base. To be honest, I'm not very particular about removing each and every cell in the skull base. Being in private practice, I'm my own junior resident, I'm my own senior resident and head of department. So it's very difficult for me to sometimes give answers to patients if some such kind of a complication can occur. So I would rather do a bit less than tend to cause complications. So we know that the skull base is slightly sloping as we go from anterior to posterior. So it's better to clear the skull base from posterior to anterior. If injury has occurred, we would first rather identify that area properly. And then since almost all of us are conversant with management of these kind of fractures, it's better to put a fat plug technique initially, because these defects may not be very large. They may not be very huge. So a simple fat plug technique can sometimes suffice. We remove the mucosa all around, we remove the bony chips all around, and then pack that area. But this is far more common complication than, I believe, although touchwood has not occurred with me, but I believe it is far more common than even lacrimal sac or internal carotid artery injury. So this is something which I do counsel the patient for. Even in simple FES, I do tell them that there is a potential for the brain fluid to leak, which is pretty uncommon, but you should be aware of this.
Hitesh, sir, your points.
Preoperative anatomy is very important. If there's a Kiros type 3, then risk of injury to the ethmoid plate area is very high, cribriform plate area is very high. And another way, fovea is low lying, then the risk of injury to that area is high. So preoperative anatomical knowledge is very important. If disease is extensive, then it's better to go from posterior to anterior direction rather than going anterior to posterior direction. If disease is limited, to better to avoid touching the area which is really close to skull base. Avoid unnecessary avulging of tissue. That's microdebrider. Why it's come in picture? Because it's not it just cut and suck and cut. But if you're pulling the mucosa, then there's a risk of CSF leak is there. Or most common site of this is a middle turbinate pulling because it attaches with the skull base. So knowledge is very important. Once injury is occurred, there are two different kind of injury. One is you identified intraoperatively, and one is postoperatively. If intraoperatively identified, better to cover the defect. It's like a traumatic injury, like we see in wards. The patient came to emergency, there is a trauma. So by conservative management, anyhow they heal. But if you're closing the defect, then chances of healing is very high. So in that case, either depending upon the size of the defect, if it is less than 5 mm, then it's indicated 1 or 2 layer, either as Kocher sir said, fat or fascia graft we can use. But if it is large defect, then it's bony. There's a underlay kind of bony repair from intracranial side. You can use graft and then cartilage or bone, and then again graft or then fascia and all that. If it is identified in post-operative period, better to use measures to prevent the rising of intracranial pressure, like stool softeners, avoid cuffing, head and elevation, 30-degree head and elevation. If leak is persisting for 3 to 4 days, it is not responding, then lumbar drain is indicated, and you can go ahead with 4 to 5 days lumbar drain. And if it, even after that, if it is not responding, then you go ahead with surgery. Or if leak is very high, even after other measures, then you can go ahead with surgery at early stage also.
Dr. Ravneet, you want to add?
I think Dr. Hitesh covered most of it. So again, with radiology, coming back to it, identify any dehiscences in the skull base preoperatively. You could have a disease. There could be an incidental, defect in the skull base, which might or might not be leaking at the time if the dura is intact. So preoperatively, just make sure you read the scans very carefully. As Dr. Kocher said, and Dr. Hitesh reiterated that you don't need to always go and remove everything because as we know that most of it is done for CRS, and CRS is primarily a medically managed disease without nasal polyposis. So what we're trying to do is establishing a pathway for the medical management for the nasal steroid sprays to be placed in the post-operative period. So it's not always necessary that you risk a CSF leak to remove everything. And I have heard some anecdotal reports from other senior surgeons where they've said that while removing nasal polyposis, they've identified a meningoencephalocele at the same time, which was initially there was just on CT scan plain NCCT, they thought it was just a defect, but in all those polyposis, they've been able to identify it, and you can either, and a lot of people actually don't manage it in the first stage only. You can do a second stage surgery just for the meningoencephalocele. But it is really important to identify if you have a CSF leak during your surgery, there'll be a washout of the blood, which is called the washout sign, and suddenly the clear fluid will start dissipating the blood around. So that is important to identify and repair, as Sir said, because in the post-operative period, then you're putting the patient at risk for meningitis. So we have to be careful regarding that if it happens, the management part is pretty standard. But again, identification is really important.
So one question is in the chat box. In allergic rhinitis, what is the role of inferior turbinectomy and how to balance with medical treatment?
I think Dr. Kocher is doing a lot of allergy.
Yes,
So
Kocher sir, you can.
Yeah. So first of all, inferior turbinectomy per se has no role. It's the blocker kind of allergic rhinitis where nasal blockage becomes a paramount problem for the patient. So what I've realized is, first of all, the blocker symptoms are to be addressed medically. If we have done, if we have given a combination of intranasal antihistamines and intranasal corticosteroids along with nasal irrigation, and still the patient has symptoms, then we can go ahead and do a submucosal reduction and out fracture of the inferior turbinate along with septal body reduction. But do take care that the septal body reduction should not be done bilaterally, or it may cause a septal perforation. So this improves the nasal passage completely thorough from anterior to posterior, and also in the anterior valve area if the septal body is reduction done properly. So I've had patients who have had problem of persistent watery nasal discharge along with congestion and blockage. They improved with the septal body reduction, which was a surprise to me as well. So while reducing, one more thing has to be taken care, that this reduction of turbinate has to be done along the entire length. So the probe does not sometimes reach up till the posterior pole of the inferior turbinate. So we probably have to address it. I usually do address it from posterior to anterior. First, I insert the probe from the middle part, from middle to the posterior half. And then in the second part, I go from anterior pole to the middle half. So that is how I do it.
Okay, sir. Any question from the participants or from the delegates? So thank you very much, Hitesh sir, for giving us time. Kochhar sir,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jay. Thanks for organizing this in these tough times.
Yes, thank you, sir. Dr. Lavneet.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, bye.